When Marcus Chen's waterproof camera was finally recovered from Blackwater Lake 3 years after he and his best friend vanished, the final photographs revealed they had discovered something that got them both executed. The drought that exposed their bodies also uncovered the underwater graveyard, where a respected businessman had been hiding evidence of over a decade of violent crimes, turning two friends' annual fishing trip into their death sentence. Marcus Chen folded his favorite fishing shirt into the tackle box organizer, checking his list for the third time that Friday evening. Every year since college, he and David had made this trip to Blackwater Lake, and every year Marcus approached it with the same methodical precision that made him such a reliable accountant. "Dude, you're overthinking this," David Rodriguez called from the driveway, loading beer into the cooler with characteristic casualness. "We're going fishing, not planning a space mission." Marcus smiled despite himself. David's laid-back attitude had balanced his own careful nature for over a decade of friendship. While Marcus color-coded his tackle box, David grabbed whatever lures looked promising and trusted his bartender's charm to make up for any lack of preparation. The drive north would take them 4 hours into Michigan's remote wilderness, far from the suburban Detroit neighborhoods where they'd both settled with their wives. Sarah Chen waved from the kitchen window, already 8 months pregnant with their first child. Lisa Rodriguez stood beside her, shaking her head at David's hasty packing. "You remember to pack actual food this time?" Lisa called out, knowing her husband's tendency to survive on gas station snacks and optimism. "Marcus packed enough for a small army," David replied, hefting the cooler into his truck. "Besides, we're catching dinner tomorrow night." The annual trip had become sacred to both men. 3 days without phones, without deadlines, without the responsibilities of adult life pressing down on them. Just two friends, a pristine lake, and the simple challenge of outwitting fish with more patience than either of them possessed. Marcus loaded his camera bag last, the digital SLR he'd bought specifically for these wilderness excursions. He enjoyed documenting their adventures, creating albums that Sarah would flip through during winter months, reminding them both that warmer days would return. The sun was setting as they finished packing, painting the suburban sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow morning they'd drive through increasingly wild country until they reached Blackwater Lake, a hidden gem Marcus had discovered through an obscure rental website. The cabin owner promised complete isolation, crystal clear water, and fish that hadn't seen a lure in months. "Ready for another legendary Chen Rodriguez fishing expedition?" David asked, slamming the truck's tailgate. Marcus nodded, anticipation building in his chest. Neither man suspected this trip would be different from all the others, or that by Sunday evening their wives would be making frantic phone calls to park rangers, beginning a nightmare that would consume the next 5 years of their lives. The GPS signal faded somewhere around mile marker 47, leaving David to navigate the increasingly narrow forest roads by memory and intuition. Marcus gripped the door handle as the truck bounced through another pothole, his carefully organized tackle box rattling in the back. "You sure you remember how to get there?" Marcus asked, watching towering pines close in around them like cathedral walls. "Relax, city boy," David replied, downshifting as the road turned to gravel. "I've got this." The transformation from suburban Detroit to wilderness had been gradual but dramatic. First, the strip malls and gas stations disappeared. Then the houses grew farther apart. And finally, even the power lines vanished. Now, they drove through what felt like untouched forest, the kind of place where cell phones became expensive paperweights. After another hour of winding through unmarked roads, they spotted the cabin. It sat on a small rise overlooking Blackwater Lake, exactly as the rental photos had promised. The structure was rustic but clean, with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch that faced the water. Marcus stepped out of the truck and immediately noticed the silence. No traffic, no neighbors, no city sounds at all. Just wind through pine needles and the gentle lap of water against the shore. The lake stretched before them like a dark mirror, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to go on forever. "Now, this is what I'm talking about," David said, breathing deeply. "Pure wilderness." They unloaded their gear quickly, eager to explore. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Marcus discovered a guest book on the coffee table, filled with entries from previous visitors praising the lake's beauty and fishing opportunities. "Look at this," he said, flipping through pages of enthusiastic reports. "Guy from last month caught a 20-pound northern pike right off the dock." David was already assembling his fishing rod. "Then we better get out there before dark." As they walked down to the water, Marcus pulled out his camera to document their arrival. The late afternoon sun painted the lake in golden tones, with mist beginning to rise from the far shore. It looked like something from a nature magazine, pristine and untouched. Perfect weather for tomorrow, David observed, testing his line. Marcus nodded, already planning their strategy. They'd start early, explore the entire lake systematically, and with any luck, catch enough fish to justify their boasting rights for another year. Neither man noticed the fresh tire tracks leading to the abandoned dock on the far shore, or realized they weren't as alone in this wilderness paradise as they believed. The aluminum boat cut smoothly through the mirror-like surface of Blackwater Lake as Marcus and David launched at first light Saturday morning. The rental boat was basic but sturdy, with a small electric motor that would get them around the lake without disturbing the fish. "Water's perfect," David observed, dipping his hand over the side. Clear as glass and not a ripple in sight. Marcus had his tackle organized by species and water depth, while David grabbed whatever looked good from his jumbled box. They started near the cabin's dock, casting into the shallows where bass might be feeding in the early morning warmth. Within 20 minutes, Marcus felt the familiar tug on his line. His rod bent as something fought hard in the depths, and after a brief battle, he landed a decent-sized largemouth bass. "First fish of the trip goes to the accountant," David said with mock disgust. "There's no justice in the world." "Patience and preparation," Marcus replied, carefully photographing his catch before releasing it back into the lake. They spent the morning working their way around the shoreline, discovering hidden coves and submerged logs that looked promising. David finally connected with a nice northern pike near a fallen tree, evening the score. The fish fought like fury, nearly snapping his rod before he got it to the boat. By midday, they'd explored most of the lake's main body, but the far shore held interesting possibilities. An old dock jutted out from a secluded cove, its wooden planks gray with age and partially collapsed into the water. Beyond it, the forest grew thick and dark. "Wonder who built that," Marcus said, steering them closer to investigate. "Probably some old fishing camp from way back," David replied. "This whole area used to be logging country before it became state land." They tied up to the abandoned dock and ate lunch in its shade, enjoying the complete silence of the wilderness. No boats, no other fishermen, no sounds except water lapping against wood and the distant call of a loon. "This is what we come for," Marcus said, taking photos of the pristine scenery. "Tomorrow we'll hit this area hard," David agreed. "Bet there's some monster fish hiding under those logs." They spent the afternoon fishing the main lake, adding several more bass and a couple of bluegill to their catch and release tally. As the sun began to set, they headed back to the cabin with grins and stories, already planning Sunday's strategy. The abandoned dock would wait for them, along with its dark secrets hidden beneath the surface, secrets that would cost them everything. Sunday morning brought overcast skies and a light chop on the water, but Marcus and David were eager to explore the promising area near the abandoned dock. They launched the boat early, Marcus bringing his waterproof GPS unit to mark any productive fishing spots they discovered. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. And ever oppers, to be unexpected. "Look at all those submerged logs," David said as they approached the collapsed dock. "Perfect base habitat." The old structure had clearly been there for decades, its support posts still visible beneath the dark water. Marcus steered carefully around the debris, while David cast his lure toward a promising tangle of fallen timber. "Got something," Marcus announced after his third cast. His rod bent sharply, but instead of the fighting pull of a fish, he felt dead weight. "Feels like I'm snagged on something big." David reeled in his line and moved to help. Together they worked Marcus's lure, trying different angles to free it from whatever held it fast. The line went slack suddenly, then caught again on something else. "There's a lot of junk down there," David observed. "Maybe old dock materials." Marcus switched to a heavier sinker and cast again, this time deliberately trying to hook whatever was causing the snag. When he pulled up, something metallic glinted just beneath the surface before sinking back into the depths. "Did you see that?" he asked, excitement building in his voice. David leaned over the side, peering into the dark water. Cast again, same spot. This time, when Marcus pulled, they both saw it clearly. A curved piece of metal, dark blue or black, definitely not natural debris. It looked too uniform, too manufactured to be old dock equipment. "That's part of a car," David said quietly. "Has to be." Marcus immediately pulled out his GPS unit, marking the coordinates. "We should report this to the park rangers when we get back." "Probably been there for years," David replied, but his voice carried a new tension. "Maybe decades." They tried fishing other areas, but the discovery had changed the mood of their trip. Both men found themselves glancing back toward the submerged object, wondering what story it might tell. Marcus took several photos of the location, making sure he could find it again. "Should we try to get a better look?" David asked. "Water's too murky," Marcus replied, "and we don't have diving gear. Better to let the authorities handle it." They spent the rest of the morning fishing half-heartedly before heading back to pack up. Neither man spoke much during the drive back to the cabin, both lost in thought about their underwater discovery. As they loaded their gear for the trip home, Marcus double-checked that his GPS coordinates were saved. The metallic glint haunted both their minds, a mystery hidden in the depths of their perfect fishing lake. Sarah Chen glanced at the kitchen clock for the 10th time in 20 minutes, 8:15 on Sunday evening, and Marcus hadn't called. He always called when they were running late from fishing trips, a habit born from years of marriage and her tendency to worry. She tried his cell phone again, listening to the automated message about the caller being out of service range. That wasn't unusual at Blackwater Lake, but Marcus had promised to drive to higher ground and check in if they decided to stay late. By 8:30, Sarah was dialing Lisa Rodriguez. "Have you heard from David?" Sarah asked when Lisa picked up. "Not since they left Friday morning," Lisa replied, though her voice carried the same edge of concern. They were supposed to be back by dinner time. The two women had been through this routine before. Marcus and David occasionally lost track of time when the fishing was good, staying an extra few hours to chase one more bite. But they'd never been this late without calling, and both wives knew their husbands well enough to recognize when something felt wrong. Maybe they had car trouble, Lisa suggested, though neither woman believed it. By 9 o'clock, Sarah was calling the rental agency. The automated system connected her to an emergency number, where a bored-sounding woman confirmed that the Chen Rodriguez party had been expected to check out by 4 that afternoon. No, they hadn't called to extend their stay. "Should I send someone to check on them?" the woman asked. "Yes," Sarah said immediately. "Please." Lisa arrived at Sarah's house 20 minutes later, finding her friend pacing the living room with her phone clutched in her hand. They sat together on the couch, making increasingly frantic calls. The rental agency, local hospitals, the sheriff's department. "Ma'am, we can't file a missing persons report until they've been gone 24 hours, the dispatcher explained patiently. "Grown men go fishing, sometimes they lose track of time." "This isn't like them," Sarah insisted, her voice rising. "Marcus would call. He always calls." By 10:30, both women were crying. They'd exhausted every logical explanation, every reasonable delay. Sarah kept thinking about Marcus's promise to be careful, his excitement about documenting the trip with his camera. David had joked about catching the big one, planning to mount it on his wall. Neither man had mentioned discovering anything unusual at the lake, anything that might explain why they hadn't come home. The last text message Sarah had received was Marcus's photo of their first day's catch, sent Saturday evening with a simple caption, "Having a blast." Having. Now the silence stretched through another night, and both wives knew with growing certainty that something terrible had happened to their husbands in the wilderness they'd trusted to keep them safe. Sheriff Janet Mills arrived at Blackwater Lake Monday morning with a full search and rescue team, her 20-year career having taught her that missing persons cases in remote wilderness required immediate, aggressive action. The rental cabin sat empty, Marcus and David's truck parked in the gravel driveway exactly where they'd left it Friday evening. "No signs of struggle inside," Deputy Harrison reported after checking the cabin. "Beds weren't slept in Sunday night, but their gear is gone. Fishing rods, tackle boxes, life jackets." Mills walked the shoreline, noting the absence of the aluminum boat they'd rented with the cabin. The lake stretched before them like black glass, giving up no secrets. She radioed for the dive team and helicopter support, knowing that every hour increased the odds of recovery rather than rescue. "Could be a simple boating accident," Deputy Harrison suggested. "Maybe they went out early Sunday. Boat capsized, bodies got swept into deeper water." Mills wasn't convinced. Two experienced fishermen didn't just vanish without leaving some trace behind. She'd seen enough drowning victims to know that bodies and debris usually surfaced within days, especially in a contained lake system like Blackwater. The helicopter arrived first, its rotors churning the morning air as it began systematic grid searches of the lake and surrounding forest. The pilot reported no obvious signs of distress, no overturned boats, no debris fields that might indicate an accident. At 11:30, a dive team member surfaced near the far shore, signaling the recovery crew. They'd found the missing boat drifting in a small cove, its anchor dragged and motor tilted up. The discovery sent ripples of hope through the gathered families until the divers climbed aboard. "Boat's in perfect condition," the team leader reported to Mills. "No damage, no blood. Life jackets are still tied down. Looks like it was just abandoned." Sarah and Lisa Rodriguez had driven up from Detroit, arriving as the boat was being towed to shore. Sarah clutched Marcus's favorite coffee mug, something she'd grabbed randomly from the kitchen in her panic. Lisa held David's baseball cap, the one he wore to every Tigers game. "Where are they?" Sarah asked Mills, her voice barely a whisper. If the boat is fine, where are my husband and his friend? Mills studied the pristine aluminum boat, its fishing rods still secured in their holders, tackle boxes undisturbed. Everything suggested the men had simply stepped out of the boat and vanished, leaving no clue about why or where they'd gone. We're expanding the search to include the entire forest surrounding the lake, Mills told the families. Sometimes people abandon boats to walk for help, maybe got turned around in the woods. But privately, she was already considering darker possibilities. The boat's condition was too perfect, too clean. Someone had either staged this scene or the two friends had encountered something that made them abandon their fishing trip and flee into the wilderness. The tip line established by Sheriff Mills rang constantly in the first weeks after Marcus and David's disappearance, generating dozens of reports from across northern Michigan. Sarah and Lisa took turns manning the phones at the makeshift command center, desperately hoping each call would bring the breakthrough they needed. 2 men matching your description were seen at Murphy's gas station in Grayling, a caller reported Tuesday morning. Acting nervous, paid cash for snacks, and kept looking over their shoulders. Mills dispatched deputies to review the security footage, but the timestamp showed the sighting occurred 2 days before Marcus and David had even left for their fishing trip. The caller had confused dates, transforming a routine gas stop into a suspicious encounter through the distortion of memory and hope. A hiker called Wednesday claiming he'd seen 2 men arguing near a trail 15 miles from Blackwater Lake. The description matched perfectly, he insisted, down to David's Tigers baseball cap and Marcus's red flannel shirt. Deputies spent 8 hours combing the area before discovering the hiker had been taking prescription pain medication that affected his perception. The argument was likely between 2 park rangers conducting routine patrol. The most promising lead came from a waitress at a diner in Traverse City, who swore she'd served Marcus and David pancakes Sunday morning, hours after their boat was found abandoned. She remembered Marcus complaining about his coffee being too weak, just like Sarah said he always did. But when investigators reviewed the receipt timestamps and compared them to the discovery timeline, the sighting became impossible. People want to help, Mills explained to the families during a briefing Thursday evening. But memory plays tricks when emotions run high. Witnesses see what they hope to see, not necessarily what's actually there. Sarah hired private investigator Rebecca Torres Friday afternoon, using money from Marcus's emergency fund. Torres was a former Detroit police detective who specialized in missing persons cases. Her reputation built on solving cases other investigators had given up on. The official search is focused on accident scenarios, Torres told Sarah during their first meeting. But the evidence doesn't support an accidental drowning. That boat was too clean, too perfectly positioned. Someone wanted it found. Torres began her own investigation, interviewing locals about the lake's history, searching property records for clues about who might have reason to harm visitors. She discovered that Blackwater Lake had a darker past than the tourism website suggested, with several unsolved disappearances over the past 2 decades. This area has secrets, she told Lisa during a phone call Saturday night. Old-timers talk about things happening in those woods, illegal activities that most folks pretend not to notice. But even Torres's expertise couldn't transform false leads into real answers, and as the first week ended without Marcus and David, both wives began to accept the terrible possibility that their husbands might never come home. 6 months passed like a slow-moving nightmare, each day blending into the next in a haze of unanswered questions and fading hope. Sarah Chen had returned to work at the accounting firm, finding that routine provided some structure to her shattered world, though she jumped every time her phone rang, praying for news about Marcus. Lisa Rodriguez maintained the Facebook page they'd created, posting updates and sharing Marcus and David's photos with increasingly desperate pleas for information. The page had gained over 10,000 followers, but useful leads had dwindled to almost nothing. Well-meaning strangers offered theories and prayers, but neither brought the missing men home. "You need to start thinking about the future," Sarah's sister told her during a visit in November. "Marcus wouldn't want you to put your life on hold forever." But Sarah couldn't imagine a future that didn't include answers. She'd kept Marcus's coffee mug on the kitchen counter, his side of the bed unmade, his fishing magazines stacked exactly where he'd left them. The house felt like a museum dedicated to interrupted life. Rebecca Torres continued her investigation, though the trail had grown cold. She'd interviewed dozens of locals, researched the lake's history, and followed up on every credible lead. Her final report painted a disturbing picture of the area's hidden activities. "Blackwater Lake isn't as isolated as people think," Torres explained during her last meeting with the families. "There's been illegal activity in those woods for decades. Drug manufacturing, stolen goods storage, people who don't want witnesses." She'd uncovered stories from longtime residents about suspicious vehicles, strange sounds at night, and visitors who asked too many questions about remote areas. 3 other people had vanished from the general region over the past 20 years, though none had received the media attention that Marcus and David's case generated. The problem is proving any connection, Torres continued. Without bodies, without physical evidence, we're dealing with rumors and coincidences. Sarah had discovered she was pregnant in October, Marcus's child growing inside her as the search for him continued. The pregnancy forced her to confront difficult questions about raising a child alone, about whether to keep hoping or start grieving. "I dream about him every night," she told Lisa during one of their regular phone calls. "Sometimes he's trying to tell me something important, but I can't understand what he's saying." Lisa was struggling too, throwing herself into volunteer work at the local animal shelter to avoid the emptiness of her house. David's absence left a hole in her daily routine that no amount of activity could fill. The first anniversary approached with dreaded inevitability. Sheriff Mills had officially classified the case as a presumed drowning, despite the lack of bodies. The families planned a memorial service, though Sarah insisted it wasn't a funeral. "They're still out there somewhere," she told anyone who would listen. "I can feel it." The first anniversary memorial service took place on a gray September morning at Riverside Cemetery, where Marcus's parents had purchased a headstone despite the absence of his body. Sarah stood between the granite marker and Lisa Rodriguez, both women wearing black dresses that felt premature, like costumes for a play they weren't ready to perform. Pastor Williams spoke about faith in dark times, about trusting God's plan even when it remained hidden from human understanding. Sarah clutched her 3-month-old son Michael, Marcus's eyes staring back at her from the baby's face. She'd given him his father's middle name, hoping somehow it would bring Marcus home. Sheriff Mills attended the service, her presence a reminder that the case had officially transitioned to cold status. The active search had ended months ago, resources redirected to newer emergencies. Mills approached Sarah after the ceremony, her expression carrying the weight of professional sympathy. "We're not closing the file," Mills assured her. "If new evidence emerges, we'll investigate. But without bodies, without witnesses, there's nothing more we can do right now." Sarah nodded, understanding the reality but refusing to accept it. She'd hired Rebecca Torres for another 6 months, though the private investigator had warned that leads were exhausted. The case had generated thousands of tips, hundreds of search hours, and no answers. "I keep thinking they're out there somewhere," Sarah told Lisa as they walked back to their cars. "Maybe hurt, maybe lost, but alive." Lisa squeezed her hand, offering comfort she didn't feel. Her own grief had evolved differently, settling into a dull ache that made everyday activities feel hollow. She'd learned to function without David, though happiness remained elusive. The media attention had faded completely by winter. Marcus and David's disappearance joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries that occasionally surfaced in true crime podcasts or online forums, but generated no new leads. Their families became statistics in missing persons databases, part of the thousands of Americans who vanish annually without explanation. Sarah discovered that grief without closure created its own particular torture. Death allowed mourning, but disappearance suspended families in limbo between hope and despair. She couldn't remarry, couldn't move forward, couldn't truly grieve. Michael needed his mother present, but part of her remained frozen at Blackwater Lake, waiting for answers that might never come. "Time to face the truth," Sarah's mother advised during a Christmas visit. "Marcus is gone. You need to accept that and rebuild your life." But Sarah wasn't ready for acceptance. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of northern Michigan, her husband had vanished with his best friend, leaving behind only questions and an abandoned boat. Until someone found their bodies or discovered what had happened that Sunday morning, she would continue believing they might still come home. The case files gathered dust in the sheriff's department, another mystery added to the region's dark collection of unsolved disappearances. The drought of 2018 was the worst in northern Michigan's recorded history, dropping Blackwater Lake to levels not seen since the 1930s. What had once been deep fishing waters became exposed mudflats, revealing secrets that had been hidden beneath the surface for decades. Kevin Martinez was hiking the newly exposed lake bed on a Tuesday morning in August when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Partially buried in the dried mud, bleached white by years underwater, were unmistakably human bones. Martinez called 911 from his cell phone, his hands shaking as he tried to describe the location to the dispatcher. Within an hour, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had replaced the retired Janet Mills, was coordinating the recovery operation. Dr. Patricia Vance, the county medical examiner, arrived by helicopter with her forensic team. The drought had created a unique opportunity to examine areas of the lake that would normally require expensive underwater recovery operations. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. "We have 2 complete skeletons," Dr. Vance reported to Sheriff Bradley after the initial survey. "Adult males, based on bone structure. They've been here for several years, minimum. The discovery location was approximately 50 yards from where Marcus and David's abandoned boat had been found 3 years earlier. The coordinates matched almost exactly with GPS data that Sheriff Mills had recorded during the original investigation. Sarah Chen received the call at her office in Detroit. Sheriff Bradley's voice, careful and professional, as he delivered news she'd both hoped for and dreaded. Her son Michael was playing quietly at daycare, unaware that his father might finally be coming home. "We can't confirm identities until we complete forensic analysis," Bradley explained. "But given the location and circumstances, we believe there's a strong connection to the 2015 disappearance." Lisa Rodriguez met Sarah at the medical examiner's office that afternoon, both women holding each other for support as Dr. Vance explained the identification process. Dental records would provide definitive answers within 48 hours, but the preliminary examination suggested they'd found Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez. "There's something else," Dr. Vance said quietly. "Something that changes everything about this case. Both men died from gunshot wounds to the head. This wasn't an accident." The words hit both women like physical blows. Murder. Their husbands hadn't drowned or gotten lost in the wilderness. Someone had killed them and dumped their bodies in the lake, letting their families suffer 3 years of uncertainty and false hope. Sheriff Bradley reopened the case immediately, reclassifying it as a double homicide. The pristine boat, the lack of evidence, the perfect staging, it all made sense now. Someone had executed Marcus and David, then carefully arranged the scene to suggest an accidental drowning. The drought had finally given up Blackwater Lake's darkest secret, but the revelation brought no peace to the grieving families, only new questions about who had murdered their loved ones and why. Dr. Patricia Vance had performed hundreds of autopsies during her 15-year career, but examining remains that had been submerged for 3 years presented unique challenges. The bones told their story in fractured whispers, revealing secrets that Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez had taken to their underwater grave. Both victims suffered single gunshot wounds to the posterior skull, Dr. Vance explained to Detective Ray Sullivan, who had been assigned to lead the homicide investigation. Close range, execution style. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. Sullivan studied the forensic photographs, his jaw tightening as the evidence painted a picture of cold-blooded murder. The bullet trajectory suggested both men had been kneeling when they were shot, possibly with their hands bound, though soft tissue decomposition had destroyed any evidence of restraints. "Time of death?" Sullivan asked. "Based on bone condition and environmental factors, I'd estimate they died within days of their disappearance in 2015, Dr. Vance replied. The lake's cold temperature and low oxygen levels preserved the skeletal remains remarkably well. The dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The bones belonged to Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez, ending 3 years of uncertainty for their families but opening a murder investigation that had grown cold before it even began. Sullivan examined the recovery site, noting its proximity to where the abandoned boat had been found. The killer had weighted the bodies to keep them submerged, but the drought had exposed their crime scene. Metal fragments recovered with the remains suggested the weights had been chains or anchors, now rusted away to almost nothing. "Any evidence of defensive wounds?" Sullivan asked. Dr. Vance shook her head. "The victims were likely restrained or caught completely off guard. There's no indication they fought back or tried to escape." The forensic analysis revealed additional disturbing details. Both men had been wearing the same clothes described by their wives, but personal items like wallets and watches were missing. Marcus's waterproof camera, which Sarah had mentioned repeatedly during the original investigation, was nowhere to be found. This was robbery with murder, Sullivan concluded, though the theory felt incomplete. Someone killed them for their equipment. Cash, maybe the boat. But Dr. Vance's final discovery complicated that simple explanation. Embedded in the mud near David's remains, she found a small metal fragment that had escaped the killer's cleanup efforts. The piece was too corroded for immediate identification, but its shape and size suggested it might have come from a vehicle. "Could be a key, maybe part of a tool, Doctor," Vance told Sullivan. "Something the killer dropped during the disposal." The fragment was sent to the state crime lab for analysis, though results would take weeks. Meanwhile, Sullivan faced the challenge of investigating a 3-year-old double homicide, with virtually no witnesses, no suspects, and a crime scene that had been underwater until the drought exposed it. He called Sarah and Lisa to deliver the official confirmation, their tears audible through the phone as years of uncertainty finally ended in the worst possible way. Their husbands were dead, murdered by someone who had walked away free for 3 years. The case that had begun as a missing persons investigation was now a hunt for a killer who believed they had committed the perfect crime. Tech specialist Jamie Park had seen countless waterlogged electronics during her career with the State Crime Lab, but Marcus Chen's camera presented unique challenges. After 3 years underwater in Blackwater Lake, the digital memory card appeared completely destroyed, its circuits corroded and data seemingly lost forever. "The camera body is ruined," Park explained to Detective Sullivan as she examined the device under high-powered magnification. "But sometimes we can recover data from memory cards even after severe water damage. The actual storage chips are more resilient than people think." Park used specialized equipment to carefully separate the memory card's components, accessing the storage chip directly rather than relying on the damaged circuit board. The process took hours of delicate work, removing corrosion and bypassing destroyed pathways to reach the data underneath. "I'm getting something," Park announced after her third attempt at data recovery. "The last few photos are corrupted, but there's definitely recoverable information here." The first images appeared exactly as Sarah had described. Marcus and David setting up camp, catching their first fish, documenting their wilderness adventure with the enthusiasm of longtime friends. But as Park scrolled through the chronological sequence, the photos began telling a different story. The final images, taken Sunday morning near the abandoned dock, showed the two friends pulling something metallic from the water. Park enhanced the photos, adjusting contrast and brightness to reveal details that had been obscured by murky lake water and poor lighting conditions. "That's definitely part of a vehicle," Sullivan observed, studying the enhanced images. "Looks like a rear bumper or trunk section." Park continued processing the recovered data, finding GPS coordinates embedded in the photo metadata. The location matched exactly where Marcus and David's bodies had been discovered, confirming they'd been murdered at the same spot where they'd made their underwater discovery. "There's more," Park said, pulling up additional images. "Look at this one." The final photograph was partially corrupted, but clearly showed both men examining what appeared to be a license plate. The image quality was poor, damaged by water and time, but Park's enhancement software could make out partial letters and numbers. "Can you run the partial plate through the database?" Sullivan asked. "Already on it," Park replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "The readable portions are BT74 something, running it against stolen vehicle reports from the past decade." The search produced dozens of possibilities, but one result made Sullivan's pulse quicken. A blue Honda Civic reported stolen in 2010, license plate BTV7432. The theft had occurred the same week as 3 armed robberies in neighboring counties, crimes that had never been solved. Marcus and David found evidence of those robberies, Sullivan realized. Someone's been using Blackwater Lake as a dumping ground for stolen cars, probably for years. Park nodded grimly. "And when your victims started taking pictures and marking GPS coordinates, the killer panicked. Had to eliminate the witnesses." The digital evidence was transforming the case from a random double homicide into something much larger. Someone had been operating a sophisticated disposal operation at Blackwater Lake, using the remote location to hide evidence of multiple crimes. Marcus and David had stumbled onto this secret, documenting it with Marcus's camera, sealing their fate. Sullivan stared at the recovered photographs, understanding that he was looking at the last moments of 2 innocent men who'd discovered something they were never meant to see. Detective Sullivan spread case files across the conference table like pieces of a massive jigsaw puzzle, each document revealing another fragment of a criminal operation that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The stolen Honda Civic from Marcus's camera was just the beginning, a single thread that unraveled a tapestry of unsolved crimes stretching back over a decade. "Look at this pattern," Sullivan told his partner Detective Martinez, pointing to a map dotted with colored pins. 3 armed robberies in 2010, same week the Honda was stolen. 2 more in 2012. Bank robbery in 2014. All the crimes shared common elements that had been overlooked by separate investigations. Professional execution, stolen getaway vehicles that were never recovered, and proximity to northern Michigan's remote wilderness areas. The perpetrators had been systematic, organized, and smart enough to use Blackwater Lake as their personal disposal site. "They dump the evidence in the lake, it sinks to the bottom, case goes cold," Martinez observed. "Perfect system until those 2 fishermen came along." Sullivan pulled up property records for the area surrounding Blackwater Lake. Most of the land was state-owned forest, but several private parcels offered secluded access to the water. One name appeared repeatedly in the ownership documents, a local businessman who'd been quietly acquiring remote properties for decades. Warren Kellaway owned a construction company, 2 auto repair shops, and various real estate holdings throughout the region. His legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for moving stolen vehicles, while his remote properties offered ideal locations for planning and staging criminal activities. Guys got boat launches, private access roads, even a few cabins for rent, Sullivan noted, studying Kellaway's portfolio. He could bring stolen cars to the lake without anyone seeing. The timeline painted a disturbing picture. Kellaway had purchased his first lakefront property in 2006, just before the unsolved crimes began escalating in frequency and sophistication. Each robbery was followed by the mysterious disappearance of stolen vehicles that police assumed had been chopped for parts or shipped out of state. Instead, they were 50 feet underwater, Sullivan realized. Weighted down, out of sight, evidence destroyed. Martinez pulled up Kellaway's background, finding a man with minor arrests in his youth but no serious criminal record as an adult. His businesses were profitable, his taxes current, his public image that of a successful local entrepreneur who employed dozens of people. Perfect cover, she observed. Nobody suspects the guy who sponsors Little League teams and donates to charity. The investigation revealed that Kellaway had been methodically eliminating evidence for years, creating what he believed was the perfect disposal system. Remote location, deep water, minimal law enforcement presence, and his own properties providing convenient access. He'd turned Blackwater Lake into his personal evidence graveyard. But Marcus and David had accidentally discovered his secret, documenting it with GPS coordinates and photographs. They'd stumbled onto a criminal empire that had operated undetected for over a decade, and their curiosity had cost them their lives. Sullivan stared at Kellaway's business photo, seeing the face of a man who'd committed multiple felonies and 2 murders while hiding behind a facade of respectability. Now he had to prove it. The investigation into Warren Kellaway's criminal network expanded rapidly once Detective Sullivan obtained search warrants for his businesses and properties. What they discovered was a sophisticated operation that had been systematically robbing banks and armored cars across 3 states for over a decade. Kellaway's construction company served as the perfect front, employing men with criminal backgrounds who were loyal to their boss and kept quiet about side activities. His auto repair shops provided expertise for modifying stolen vehicles, removing identification numbers, and preparing getaway cars that could be quickly disposed of after jobs. "Look at this," Detective Martinez said, studying financial records seized from Kellaway's office. "His legitimate businesses barely break even, but he's been purchasing expensive properties and equipment with cash. Where's that money coming from?" The answer emerged from encrypted files found on Kellaway's computer. He'd been meticulous about record keeping, documenting every robbery, every stolen vehicle, every piece of evidence dumped in Blackwater Lake. The digital trail revealed 15 major crimes spanning from 2006 to 2015. Sullivan called in FBI assistance when the scope became clear. Agent Patricia Morse arrived with a team of federal investigators who specialized in organized crime networks. The case had evolved beyond a simple double homicide into a racketeering investigation with interstate implications. Kellaway wasn't working alone, Agent Morse concluded after reviewing the evidence. This operation required multiple people with specific skills. Surveillance experts, drivers, weapons specialists, financial launderers. The network included 6 core members, all employees or associates of Kellaway's legitimate businesses. They'd operated like a professional crew, planning jobs months in advance, using sophisticated surveillance equipment, and maintaining strict operational security. Their success rate was remarkable: 13 major heists, with no arrests until now. The breakthrough came when investigators located Kellaway's hidden storage facility, a warehouse disguised as a surplus equipment depot. Inside, they found weapons, surveillance gear, police scanners, and detailed maps of potential targets. Most damning was a collection of newspaper clippings documenting their crimes, trophies that Kellaway had apparently kept as proof of his success. "Guy's got an ego," Sullivan observed, studying the scrapbook of criminal achievements. "Probably got off on reading about himself in the papers." Agent Morse found evidence that the network had been planning their biggest score when Marcus and David stumbled onto their disposal site. Bank records showed unusual activity in the weeks before the fisherman's disappearance, suggesting the crew was preparing for another major heist. They killed 2 innocent people to protect a robbery they hadn't even committed yet, she realized. Marcus and David died for discovering old evidence, but Kellaway was paranoid about future operations being compromised. The investigation revealed that Kellaway had been using Blackwater Lake as his personal evidence graveyard for years, disposing of stolen vehicles, weapons, and anything else that could link his crew to their crimes. The remote location and his ownership of surrounding properties made it the perfect disposal site until the drought exposed his secrets. Sullivan stared at crime scene photos from 15 different heists, understanding that Marcus and David had accidentally uncovered one of the most successful criminal networks in Michigan history. Their discovery had cost them their lives, but it would finally bring justice for over a decade of unsolved crimes. The network that had seemed untouchable was finally exposed, all because two friends had gone fishing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Private investigator Rebecca Torres had never completely let go of the Chen Rodriguez case, even after the families could no longer afford her services. The discovery of the bodies 3 years later vindicated her instincts that something sinister had happened at Blackwater Lake, and she immediately contacted Detective Sullivan to offer her assistance. "I've been tracking property records around that lake for years," Torres told Sullivan during their first meeting. "There's one name that keeps appearing in connection with suspicious activity: Warren Kellaway." Torres pulled out files she'd maintained at her own expense, documents that painted a disturbing picture of Kellaway's growing influence in the area. He'd been systematically acquiring remote properties, always paying cash, always through shell companies that obscured his direct involvement. "Look at this pattern," she said, spreading photographs across Sullivan's desk. Kellaway rented the same cabin Marcus and David used at least 6 times between 2010 and 2015, always the weekend before or after major crimes in the region. The revelation sent electricity through the investigation. Torres had discovered what law enforcement had missed. Kellaway had been using the rental cabin as a surveillance post, monitoring the lake area for potential witnesses or problems that might threaten his disposal operation. He knew exactly when people were coming and going, Sullivan realized, could plan his dumping operations around legitimate visitors. Torres had also uncovered Kellaway's connection to the cabin rental agency. The owner was his cousin, a relationship that gave him advance notice of all reservations and the ability to coordinate his criminal activities with the lake's visitor schedule. Marcus and David had been unlucky enough to discover evidence during an unplanned exploration that Kellaway couldn't control. The rental records show he booked the cabin for the weekend after Marcus and David's trip, Torres continued. Probably planned to clean up any evidence they might have disturbed. But the most damning evidence Torres had discovered was a series of surveillance photos taken from her own investigation. She'd been watching Kellaway's properties intermittently, documenting his activities, when she captured images of him loading weighted objects onto a boat trailer at his private dock. "I thought he was dumping construction debris," she admitted. "Didn't realize I was photographing him disposing of murder victims." The photographs, taken just days after Marcus and David's disappearance, showed Kellaway launching a boat under cover of darkness. The images weren't clear enough for court proceedings, but they corroborated the timeline investigators had constructed from digital evidence and forensic analysis. Sullivan studied Torres's files, impressed by her methodical approach, and frustrated that law enforcement had missed these connections during the original investigation. Her private investigation had been more thorough than the official search, hampered only by her lack of legal authority to obtain warrants or access certain records. "This gives us probable cause for surveillance warrants," Sullivan told her. "We can finally put Kellaway under official scrutiny." Torres nodded, satisfaction mixing with sadness in her expression. She'd spent 3 years knowing something was wrong at Blackwater Lake, watching a killer walk free while families suffered without answers. The breakthrough felt hollow, coming too late to save Marcus and David, but hopefully soon enough to prevent future victims. Her persistence had finally connected the dots that would bring Warren Kellaway to justice. The search warrant for Warren Kellaway's properties was executed at dawn on Thursday morning, with Detective Sullivan coordinating a multi-agency operation that included state police, FBI agents, and local SWAT teams. Kellaway's construction company office was the primary target, its concrete walls and steel doors suggesting he'd built it like a fortress. "FBI, search warrant," Agent Morse shouted as tactical officers breached the front entrance. The building erupted in controlled chaos as teams spread through offices, workshops, and storage areas, documenting everything with cameras and evidence bags. Kellaway was arrested at his home 20 minutes later, Sullivan reading him his rights, while the businessman stood in his bathrobe, his carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. His wife watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she realized the man she'd married was a stranger. "I don't know what you think you're going to find," Kellaway told Sullivan during the transport to headquarters. "I run legitimate businesses. This is harassment." But the search teams were already finding evidence that contradicted his claims. Hidden in a secret compartment behind his office safe, they discovered weapons that matched ballistics evidence from multiple unsolved robberies. Modified police scanners, detailed surveillance photographs of banks, and most damning, a collection of newspaper clippings, documenting crimes that spanned over a decade. The interrogation began at noon, Kellaway flanked by his attorney while Sullivan and Agent Morse presented evidence methodically. The recovered photos from Marcus's camera, the stolen vehicle records, the financial analysis showing unexplained cash deposits, each piece building an unshakable case. Your clients discovered your dumping ground at Blackwater Lake, Sullivan told Kellaway's lawyer. They were documenting evidence of your criminal activities when your client killed them. Kellaway maintained his innocence for 6 hours, his attorney deflecting questions and demanding proof of direct involvement. But when Sullivan showed him the surveillance photos Rebecca Torres had taken, capturing him disposing of weighted objects in the lake, his composure finally cracked. Those fishermen were in the wrong place at the wrong time, Kellaway said quietly, ignoring his attorney's frantic gestures to remain silent. They were taking pictures, marking GPS coordinates. They were going to ruin everything. The confession spilled out in a torrent of rationalization and self-pity. Kellaway described following Marcus and David back to their cabin Sunday evening, demanding they give him their camera. When they refused, claiming they'd already reported the underwater discovery to park rangers, he'd panicked. I couldn't let them destroy what I'd built, he continued. 15 years of careful planning, perfect operations, all threatened by two guys who couldn't mind their own business. Sullivan felt sick listening to Kellaway describe the executions with clinical detachment, as if Marcus and David had been obstacles rather than human beings with families who loved them. The businessman had weighted their bodies and dumped them in the same lake he'd used for evidence disposal, believing the secret would remain hidden forever. The drought had finally exposed Warren Kellaway's crimes, but it had taken 3 years too long. Marcus and David were dead, their families shattered, because a greedy man had turned a pristine wilderness lake into his personal graveyard. Warren Kellaway sat in the stark interrogation room, his expensive suit wrinkled and his carefully groomed appearance disheveled after 12 hours in custody. His attorney had advised him to remain silent, but the weight of maintaining his facade for over a decade had finally become unbearable. He needed to tell someone the complete truth, even if it meant spending the rest of his life in prison. It started small, Kellaway began, his voice barely above a whisper. 2006, I was struggling to keep my construction business afloat. The economy was terrible, contracts were drying up, and I had employees depending on me for their livelihoods. Detective Sullivan listened without interruption, as Kellaway described his descent into criminality. The first job had been opportunistic, robbing a small bank in a neighboring county when he'd noticed their lax security during a legitimate visit. The success had been intoxicating, providing enough cash to save his business and pay his workers. I told myself it was temporary, Kellaway continued, just until things turned around. But the money was so easy, and I was good at planning, good at logistics. My construction background taught me how to scout locations, coordinate timing, manage teams. He recruited carefully, choosing men with criminal records who needed steady employment and wouldn't ask questions about occasional side jobs. His legitimate businesses provided perfect cover, moving equipment and personnel without attracting attention. The auto repair shops allowed him to modify stolen vehicles quickly and efficiently. Blackwater Lake was genius, he said with bitter pride. I discovered it by accident during a fishing trip with my kids. Remote, deep water, minimal law enforcement presence. Perfect place to make evidence disappear forever. The system had worked flawlessly for 9 years. Kellaway would spend weeks planning each job, using his business connections to gather intelligence about targets. After successful robberies, stolen vehicles and weapons would be weighted and dumped in the lake's deepest sections, beyond the reach of casual divers or accidental discovery. Marcus and David ruined everything, Kellaway said, his voice hardening. I was monitoring the lake that weekend, making sure the area was clear for a disposal run. When I saw them taking pictures, marking coordinates, I knew they'd found something that could destroy me. He'd followed them back to their cabin Sunday evening, initially planning to negotiate, maybe offer them money for their silence. But Marcus had been suspicious, refusing to hand over his camera, insisting they'd already reported the underwater discovery to authorities. I couldn't take that risk, Kellaway concluded. Everything I'd built, all my employees' jobs, my family's security, it would all be gone if those photos surfaced. I had to protect what I'd worked so hard to create. The rationalization sounded hollow even to him now. 2 innocent men were dead because Warren Kellaway had convinced himself that his criminal empire was worth more than their lives. He'd turned a pristine wilderness into his personal graveyard, and when witnesses threatened to expose his secret, he'd added murder to his list of crimes. Sullivan looked across the table at a man who'd hidden behind respectability while orchestrating over a decade of violent crime, finally understanding the full scope of evil that had been lurking beneath Blackwater Lake's peaceful surface. The trial of Warren Kellaway began on a gray October morning in 2019, the courthouse packed with families of his victims, law enforcement officials, and media representatives from across the country. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, clutching 4-year-old Michael's hand, while Lisa Rodriguez held a framed photo of David that she'd carried to every court hearing. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh opened with a methodical presentation of evidence that painted Kellaway as a calculating killer who'd hidden behind community respectability while orchestrating over a decade of violent crime. The recovered photographs from Marcus's camera, the ballistics evidence linking Kellaway's weapons to multiple robberies, and his own confession created an unshakable case. The defendant turned Blackwater Lake into his personal graveyard, Walsh told the jury. When Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez accidentally discovered his secret, he executed them in cold blood to protect his criminal empire. Kellaway's defense attorney, David Morrison, struggled with an impossible case. His client had confessed to 2 murders and 15 armed robberies, leaving little room for legal maneuvering. Morrison's strategy focused on portraying Kellaway as a man driven to desperation by economic circumstances, a flawed human being rather than a calculating monster. Warren Kellaway made terrible choices, Morrison argued, but he's not the cold-blooded killer the prosecution wants you to believe. He's a man who got in too deep and couldn't find his way out. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from FBI agents, forensic experts, and family members of Kellaway's victims. Sarah testified about Marcus's excitement for their fishing trip, his methodical nature, his love for documenting their adventures. Her voice broke when she described explaining to their son that his father would never come home. Lisa Rodriguez spoke about David's infectious optimism, his loyalty to Marcus, his dreams of opening his own restaurant someday. She'd brought their wedding album, showing the jury photos of the life Kellaway had destroyed with his greed and paranoia. The defense called character witnesses who described Kellaway as a generous employer and community supporter, but their testimony crumbled under cross-examination that revealed how he'd funded his philanthropy with stolen money. Detective Sullivan presented the investigation's findings, walking the jury through the sophisticated criminal network that had operated undetected for years. Agent Morse testified about the weapons cache, the surveillance equipment, and the detailed records that proved Kellaway's guilt beyond any doubt. The verdict came after 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder for Marcus and David, armed robbery for 15 additional crimes, racketeering, and weapons charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. Judge Patricia Coleman sentenced Kellaway to life without parole, adding consecutive sentences for his other crimes. You destroyed families, terrorized communities, and turned a pristine wilderness into your personal dumping ground, she told him. You will spend the rest of your days behind bars, where you can no longer harm innocent people. Sarah watched Kellaway led away in shackles, feeling neither satisfaction nor closure, only the hollow ache of justice that had come too late. Marcus and David were still dead, their families forever changed by one man's greed and ruthlessness. But at least the truth had finally emerged from the depths of Blackwater Lake, ensuring that Warren Kellaway would never hurt anyone again. The civil lawsuits began within months of Warren Kellaway's conviction, Sarah Chen and Lisa Rodriguez filing wrongful death claims against multiple parties they held responsible for their husbands' murders. The legal battles would stretch for years, but both women were determined to hold accountable everyone who had enabled the tragedy at Blackwater Lake. The first lawsuit targeted Kellaway's businesses, seeking damages from the construction company and auto repair shops that had provided cover for his criminal activities. Sarah's attorney argued that the businesses had been integral to the criminal enterprise, their profits built on blood money from robberies and murders. These weren't legitimate companies, attorney Michael Foster told the court. They were criminal fronts that employed known felons and facilitated over a decade of violent crime. The victims' families deserve compensation from every asset Kellaway used to build his empire. The cabin rental agency faced the most damaging lawsuit, accused of negligent background checks and failing to report suspicious activity. Rebecca Torres testified that Kellaway had rented the same cabin repeatedly, always around the time of major crimes, yet no one had questioned the pattern or investigated his activities. The rental agency had a duty to ensure customer safety, Foster argued. They failed to conduct proper screening, ignored obvious red flags, and allowed a known criminal to use their property for surveillance operations that led to murder. The agency's owner, Kellaway's cousin, claimed ignorance about his criminal activities despite evidence showing he'd provided advance notice of all reservations. His cooperation had allowed Kellaway to coordinate dumping operations with the lake's visitor schedule, avoiding detection for years. The county faced the largest lawsuit, accused of inadequate law enforcement in remote wilderness areas. Sarah and Lisa argued that proper patrols around Blackwater Lake would have discovered Kellaway's activities years earlier, preventing their husbands' deaths and countless other crimes. The county took tax money for law enforcement but failed to protect citizens in remote areas, Foster stated during opening arguments. If they'd done their job, Warren Kellaway would have been caught before he became a killer. The legal battles consumed 3 years, draining the families emotionally and financially. But the settlements, when they finally came, provided resources for Sarah to establish a foundation dedicated to wilderness safety and missing persons advocacy. The money couldn't bring Marcus and David back, but it could prevent future tragedies. Rebecca Torres published her book about the case, Deep Water: How Two Fishermen Exposed a Killer, donating the proceeds to the foundation. The book became a bestseller, bringing national attention to the dangers of inadequate law enforcement in remote areas. This case shows how criminals exploit isolated locations, Torres wrote in her conclusion. Marcus and David died because someone believed he could literally bury his crimes where no one would ever find them. We owe it to their memory to ensure that never happens again. The lawsuits established legal precedents for holding businesses accountable when they facilitate criminal activities, even unknowingly. They also forced counties across the country to reassess their law enforcement coverage in remote wilderness areas, potentially saving countless future victims. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but the real reckoning was still ongoing, transforming tragedy into protection for others who might venture into America's wild places, seeking the same peace that Marcus and David had found at Blackwater Lake. The memorial dedication took place on a crisp September morning in 2023, 8 years after Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez had disappeared into the wilderness they'd trusted to keep them safe. Blackwater Lake had been transformed from a crime scene into a place of remembrance, its dark waters finally serving a purpose that honored the innocent rather than hiding the guilty. Sarah Chen stood at the podium overlooking the renamed Marcus Chen Memorial Fishing Pier, her son Michael beside her, now 9 years old and tall enough to cast a line into the same waters where his father had made his final discovery. The pier extended from the exact spot where the abandoned boat had been found, a symbol of hope rising from tragedy. Marcus and David came here seeking peace, Sarah told the gathered crowd of family, friends, and law enforcement officials. They found beauty in this wilderness, joy in their friendship, and excitement in the simple pleasure of fishing together. We can't bring them back, but we can ensure their deaths weren't meaningless. The Chen Rodriguez Foundation had funded significant changes to the area. New cell towers provided coverage for emergency calls, regular ranger patrols monitored remote locations, and improved communication systems connected law enforcement agencies across 3 counties. The changes came too late for Marcus and David, but they would protect future visitors to Michigan's wilderness areas. Lisa Rodriguez spoke next, her voice steady as she described David's love for the outdoors and his unwavering friendship with Marcus. She'd remarried the previous year, finding love again with a man who understood that David would always hold a special place in her heart. The foundation work had given both women purpose, transforming their grief into protection for others. Detective Sullivan attended the ceremony, reflecting on how the case had changed his approach to missing persons investigations. The pristine boat, the stage scene, the careful disposal of evidence had taught him to look beyond obvious explanations when something felt wrong. His improved techniques had already helped solve 2 other cases. Warren Kellaway remained in maximum security prison, his appeals exhausted, his criminal empire dismantled. The man who'd believed he could hide his crimes in deep water had been undone by a drought that exposed his secrets to the light. He would die behind bars, his legacy one of greed, violence, and the destruction of innocent lives. As the ceremony concluded, Michael Chen cast his first line into Blackwater Lake, his young face serious with concentration. The water that had hidden his father's body for 3 years now reflected afternoon sunlight, beautiful and serene, its dark secrets finally purged. "Think they're watching?" Michael asked his mother as his bobber drifted across the surface. Sarah squeezed his shoulder, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I know they are, sweetheart. I know they are." The friendship that had ended in tragedy had ultimately exposed a criminal network and saved countless future victims. Marcus and David's memory lived on not just in the hearts of those who loved them, but in every family that would fish safely in waters now protected by the changes their deaths had inspired. Blackwater Lake was finally at peace, its surface reflecting sky instead of hiding sins, a place where friends could cast lines and create memories without fear of the darkness that once lurked beneath.